Welcome back to the final segment of today's conference, which is our closing panel discussion. We have 5 distinguished panelists with us here, and they will be discussing various issues about dealing with disagreements in the Singapore context. As you already know from our program brochure, our esteemed panel members are Professor Tan Tai Yong, President of the Yale NUS College, Mr. Zakir Hussain, Political and Singapore Editor at the Straits Times, Dr. Kanwaljit Soin, Consultant Orthopedic and Hand Surgeon in Private Practice, and Associate Professor Walter Theseira, who is an Associate Professor of Economics at the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Professor David Chan will be moderating this panel discussion. I will now hand over the session to Prof. Chan. Prof. Chan, please.
Okay, thank you, Noah. Noah is our MC. I should say something about him now. He's a BSI research fellow, and he'll be going to do. He just got his PhD from SMU recently, and he'll be joining NTU soon as an assistant professor, and then he'll go overseas for his postdoc. Right. So we want to thank Noah, and we want to thank our admin staff, Cindy and Geraldine, for helping us with this conference. Organizing, I think it's unbelievable. The conference is actually managed by 4 of us with no external help, with no resources. I shouldn't say anymore, right? Because my boss may be listening. Now, what we want to do here is to, this is the closing panel, of course, the grand finale. I think most of you have attended one or more, in fact, probably all of the earlier session, right? We have with us, I won't introduce them because the reason you are here is also because of them, right? Taeyong, Zakil, Kanwaljit, and Walter, all very well-known personalities to the well-informed public in Singapore. And I've given them a very simple brief, right? Basically to ask them to share with us, this will be the format, in the first 5 to 8 minutes or so, very informally on their views regarding this main topic called dealing with disagreements. But because they come from diverse backgrounds, to say a little bit, to try to focus it, 2 things, right? One is in the Singapore context specifically, and second is related to the area that they are working in, they are most passionate with, and so on. So in the case of Taeyong, he will probably be speaking on his educational experience and so on, because he's the president of Yale NUS, and of course before that he has a long history, no pun intended, he's a history professor, right? A long history of illustrious service, and he's also, I must say, an IPS another fellow as well, right? A very prestigious award to several practice in Singapore. And then I'll ask Zakil. Zakil, of course, from the Straits Times, with vast experience in media, and then I suppose he's going to share with us from the media perspective about the topic on dealing with disagreements. Kanwaljit, we know Kanwaljit well. Kanwaljit is not just somebody who fought is the correct word, I guess, who fought and spoke up a lot for women issues. She was also an NMP nominated member of parliament. But more importantly, I think she was in the earlier days and up to now, right? She's, I personally thought, a very effective, constructive civil society advocate. And I've asked her to try to speak on civil society context, right, regarding dealing with disagreements. And then last but not least, we have Walter from SUSS, the Singapore University of Social Sciences. And he's an economist by training, but he's, of course, also an NMP, nominated member of parliament in the previous parliament. And I'm going to make life difficult for him by asking him about, what happened when you disagree in parliament. And then he will, of course, speak from his experience, both as an academic and also, I think, his former experiences with public policies, right? So that's the format. As usual, any one time, type in your questions in the Q&A. I'll be able to see it, and I promise you I'll try to get to as many as possible. I just want to make a few brief remarks, right? We do have time, don't worry. I'll keep it brief. We try to make a few brief remarks that I think today, at least for me, and I know for all my friends and even people who just know me have been sending me messages, email, WhatsApp. I'm very appreciative of those messages, right? They said that they enjoyed today's session. And before we blow our own BSI trumpet, I just want to say that it is really about the people, right, who have joined us. The first session, of course, we had Tommy Cole, who was the keynote. Then I gave a speech following his, and then Fo Kwang, right, from Straits Times and from NTU RSIS was the very effective moderator. And we spoke quite a bit about a diverse issue. The purpose was to set the stage, right, for us to look at the different facets of this agreement, right? On purpose, keeping it general. But I thought our discussion also brought up many points of agreement and some points of perhaps a little minor disagreements, I would say. And then it will be quite interesting if you could follow some of these up too, right? If any of you has any comments to make, right? Then we had the second panel, and that was, of course, Lim Su Ping and Jeremy Lim, and then moderated by philosophy professor Tan Saw Hun, right? And they dealt with interesting issues about when conflicts are involved, values are involved, how do you actually deal with these disagreements, because those are quite fundamental. And Jeremy talks about the specific case of managing COVID situation, right, amid the crisis involving the foreign workers, right? A very important group to us that perhaps many of us have no direct experiences with, and I thought it's quite important to bring him in, right, into this conference to give us his perspective. And then just before that, I think you heard from two academics, my good friends and colleague, Vincent Chua from NUS Sociology, and psychologist Cheng Chi-ying from SMU, right? Both talk about social networks, social identities, and so on. And we can revisit some of these things, moderated by, of course, none other than our Matthew Matthews, who himself has done quite a bit of work, right, on social identities, both academic and translational work. And so here we are going to go through this panel quite efficiently, I think. I'll let Taeyong speak first, and then go down the list, and then I will ask each one of you a question, depending on what you say, and then I will open it up for questions and take questions from the audience. At any one time, we can interrupt each other, agree, disagree, follow up your comments, and so on, right? And I will also interrupt you, and you will also interrupt me after each one of you has a chance to express your views. Okay, with that, Taeyong, can I hand over to you? Anything from 5 to 8 minutes?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting panel. I was at the opening session with Professor Tomiko Fukwang and really enjoyed some of the opening remarks that set the tone for this panel. And I also want to thank you for your kind introduction. Now, unlike you, who's a very distinguished behavioral psychologist, David, you know, I'm a historian, you said it just now. So I've not done much by way of research and studies into behavior and how disagreements are handled. So my observations and comments that I'm going to share in the next few minutes are going to be based on my working experience as a professor working with young people in the higher education sector. So these will be based essentially in the context of a university and my experience as a university administrator and teacher. I guess the first general point I want to make is that we're seeing in the younger population today very different aspirations, different lived experiences, and in that also the desire to see more debate, accept more contestation, and also prepared to question established ideas. They operate in an environment where complex issues come thick and fast with a huge volume of information that is now instantaneously available in their hands, literally in a device that they hold. And then they're exposed to influences from all over the world, anything from Me Too movements to Black Lives Matter. And these are constantly sort of shared in terms of their social circle and also in their personal lives. Now, I'm not saying this to suggest that, our young people today are impressionable and easily influenced by what they see and hear, but the observation I have is that they are socially more conscious and more interested in looking out for people and issues beyond themselves. And many of them are staying attuned to developments around them, current affairs, and so on. And they're also aware of the causes that are important and will engage with issues, like climate change and the environment, social inequality, mental wellness, etc. And their priorities, in my view, reflect the changes that they want to see for themselves and the world around them. So it's idealistic, it's aspirational, and it's actually very motivating to see young people being interested in these broad issues beyond their immediate concerns. Importantly, they want their voices heard. They're less prepared to accept paternalistic, what they call top-down approaches, and they want to be consulted. So there's a clear trend now, and we see this in institutes of higher education, of a rise in youth activism and advocacy, which points to the greater attention that these young people now apply to a range of social issues, and accompanied by growing interest perhaps in governance decisions and expectations of greater transparency and accountability. And they're not afraid to stand up for the ideals that resonate with them and also to lead some of these changes. Another important point is that most of our young people are now digitally very adept. They can use a multitude of social media platforms to reach bigger, more diverse groups. And civic engagement has shifted mainly online now. So in the past, we used to gather in groups and talk, but now all these engagements are done online, and they are open to an exchange of views on social media, and will use these social networks also to mobilize to champion issues that are important to them. But we also know that social media engagement carries with it problems, and this was mentioned earlier today in the morning session: unfiltered, unverified, and also largely anonymous. And this can create echo chambers, or can create toxic environments where things can go terribly wrong in terms of very vexatious issues. So this is the context in which I operate in a sense, in the university. And given the changing attitudes of youth and also the increasingly complex environment that we all operate in, I feel as an educationist that there's a need to equip students with the ability to consider multiple perspectives so that they can engage in balanced and respectful discourse, disagreements, debates. And this can happen both in the public or online domains. So I think equipping them with the wherewithal, the mental attitudes, the intellectual rigor, and also the way to conduct themselves as they engage in this very complex environment is what I think we as educationists need to do. So I will make a few points about what I think and also through practice in a college that I lead should be done to encourage this sort of environment. I think first, the institutes of higher learning should cultivate an ethos of inquiry. Students should have a safe space to challenge conventional wisdom and to ask questions. And disagreements should not be avoided. In fact, they themselves could promote a culture of healthy engagement within the classroom and outside the classroom. And here I echo Professor Tommy Koh, who said this morning that we need to accept that disagreements are natural and normal, and especially so in the academic context. You push the boundaries of knowledge through disagreements. So if we are to accept disagreements as the norm, both in the social and in the academic kind of context, then it is important to know how to engage these disagreements. So the point is not to avoid or sweep things under the carpet, but to engage. And this is basically engage through debates and discussions as part of a learning process. And here I would advocate, especially amongst students who are more senior in the university, a dialogic rather than a didactic approach of engagement. In other words, give them problematic issues, allow them to see different perspectives, encourage them to question ideas, discuss and deliberate different sides of issues, explore new points of view and implications, and then basically have a lot of disagreement if it need be, but at the same time, a good discussion. So this is the environment where disagreements can happen safely and constructively. But in doing engagement, I think it's important to have what I call terms of engagement. In other words, in higher education context, there should be some agreed code of conduct, if you want, or ways of engagement. And here I just want to mention a few very briefly. I know I'm running out of time. First is responsibility. Students should learn to consider different perspectives, engage responsibly, and develop critical thinking skills, and also to make judgments based on rigorous evidence-based arguments. As David told us this morning, competence, facts do matter. So they must come from a position of competence and work with knowledge rather than polemics. Second is respect. To participate in these discussions and these disagreements respectfully. Do not attempt to shut down opposing views and do not demonize, as Tomiko said this morning, with those people who disagree with you. And also have intellectual humility and self-awareness. In other words, know that sometimes your position is wrong and be prepared to change and keep an open mind in disagreement and accept that other people just have the right to hold certain views as strongly as you hold yours. And I always hope that amongst groups that discuss vigorously different opinions, they will come to some sort of ultimate constructive outcomes despite the disagreements. Is there a possibility to seek a common ground? And I want to echo what David said this morning. Instead of aiming for an either or kind of a debate, is it possible to look for a both and kind of perspective? And in trying to then bring together different views, can they navigate these polarities so that they can develop more agility in decision-making across different contexts? So in summary, dealing with disagreements can be an important part of the learning and growing up process, especially in today's context, where youths want to have their voices heard on matters that concern them. And therefore, in the institutes of higher learning and in the schools, creating an environment where the community can disagree agreeably and understand trade-offs, complexities, and appreciate perspectives and differences, I think should be the aim of our educational institutions. David, I'm going to stop here, and I'm sure there'll be other views, and I'm happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Taeyong. I'm sure we'll come back to you soon with some questions that we have about IHL education and so on. So now over to Zakil. What about media, I suppose, the perspective?
Hi, thanks, David, for the invite, and good to join, distinguished panelists Taeyong, Kanwaljit, and Walter today. I think a lot of the points I was about to make actually kind of agree with, are in sync with what Taeyong mentioned. Disagreements are natural and normal. And I think, on a working level, every day sort of in the media, when we discuss how to approach a certain story, how much play we should give to a certain position, I think there's an active encouragement of disagreement or differing views, even among colleagues. And I think many of our younger colleagues who are very recent graduates of our local IHLs actually are able to, and I think are very aware of the need to disagree and to not just reflect, but to also consider differing views, even though they may not agree with them. I'll just cite a few recent examples. I think one of them is this COVID-19 and the sort of national approach to dealing with it. Do we want to go in the direction of being more cautious and lock down and slow down the opening up? Or do we want to be open and start resuming connections with the world, start allowing these global conferences in, start letting people dine in larger groups and so on? And I think the role of and I think one recent survey showed actually Singaporeans are pretty much split down the middle. You've got about maybe 50% feeling current measures are fine. You've got 25% who think they're too lax. You've got 25% who feel they're too strict. And there's a lot of angry comment on this issue. We get sort of daily letters, daily comments on our social media pages of people who feel, who disagree with the current approach to handling things. And I think our role sort of, as a media outlet or an organization is to not just reflect some of these differences, but to help moderate some of these positions and try and, let others in society see that there are others who may disagree, and at the same time try and help them understand why they might disagree. And I think in a way sometimes it's very, very hard to ascertain where consensus lies. Take the issue of the recent issue of plans to vaccinate 5 to 11-year-olds, right? Most, by and large, most people are fine, and they've accepted that vaccines are a public necessity in the way we deal with this pandemic. But there are differences and there are quite a number of concerns when it comes to vaccinations for younger kids. How do we reflect these disagreements? In a way, should we reflect these disagreements? You know, we're in the thick of a pandemic. And some of these are ongoing discussions that we try and we still have to grapple with. You know, how much weight do you place on disagreements or dissenting views when tackling a particular issue? How do you ensure that they are adequately represented but not overrepresented? How do you reflect disagreements in a way that doesn't quite cause public alarm? How do you ensure that you're reflecting actual ground sentiment and you're not, you know, overhyping an issue, but at the same time not underplaying an issue? I think there's no one right answer, and I think on many of these instances we just need to disagree respectfully and kind of keep lines of engagement and communication open. I do think, though, that there are some issues where perhaps playing down some disagreements might actually be better. I mean, just to cite an example, this whole issue of racial fault lines or racial sentiment that has been in the news for the past few months. You know, especially among younger readers or younger viewers, it's very hard to find a consensus, and there's wide disagreement, whether you're talking about Chinese privilege, whether you're talking about minorities being oversensitive on certain issues. And I think what we do put out or what we project or what we report on these issues is only a fraction of the sentiment out there that we might gather or that we garner. I think there's the scope for us to do more, and we're still trying to find our way on this. But right now we've taken the position that, you know, disagreements are natural, disagreements are normal, and it's important to reflect this disagreement. But I think the overriding aim is these disagreements should not lead to people concluding that it's almost impossible to resolve these disagreements. How much do you want to reflect this disagreement? How divided, you know, as society and some of the issues we grapple with become more complex, it's important, and I think it is critical to reflect differing sentiments and differing views and issues. The balance, I think, or the equilibrium we need to strike is how much emphasis do we want to place on these disagreements, or do we want to try and at the same time engender common, you know, some commonalities, or generate discussion in a way that these disagreements don't end up dividing us. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think I've got, you know, I've raised maybe more questions than points. Thank you.
Thanks, Zakil. I'm sure we have plenty of questions for you on the media, right? On its challenges, its strengths and weakness, actual or perceived, right? In terms of representing disagreements, because you are actually a very powerful pillar, right? I think in society, powerful, which means that a lot of things can happen depending on your judgment and what you say and do. While you are thinking of that power you have, I'll go to Kawanjit. I think you're going to talk about civil society, I assume. You need to unmute yourself, Kawanjit.
Okay. Thank you, David, and hello, everybody. As David has indicated, that I shall limit my opening remarks to dealing with disagreements between policymakers and civil society or advocacy groups. Now, according to the Thomas Kilman Conflict Mode Inventory, there are 5 resolution strategies that are often used in dealing with disagreements. That's avoiding, accommodating, competing, collaborating, and compromising. And Professor Cheng alluded to this when she was talking of identity integrators. But I am referring to this as strategies used when there are disagreements between policymakers and civil society. 1, competing. Now, a high degree of assertive behavior with little focus on the relationship is referred to as competing. In this mode, one side seeks to win above all else. The figure of Lee Kuan Yew looms large over modern Singapore. He was a competitive and combative, and in general, his style served Singapore well in the early years of Singapore's independence. But it was not a style that did much for the development of civil society. Civil society believes that this heavy-handed style of LKY was demonstrated during the Marxist conspiracy of 1987, when 22 social activists were detained and accused of planning to subvert the existing system of government and to seize power in Singapore. The truth of the allegations has been questioned by many. In an interview with the Straits Times on 14th of December 2001, then Senior Minister of State Tharman Shanmugaratnam said, and I quote, "Although I had no access to state intelligence, from what I knew of them, most were social activists, but not out to subvert the system." Unquote. Since those days, the political leadership style has changed, but the issue of the so-called Marxist conspiracy has still not been resolved, and we are none the wiser about whether there really was some evil plot or not. 2, avoiding. Sometimes activists may disagree with policymakers, but decide not to do anything about it. This is when we use the avoiding mode. This is appropriate for trivial disagreements or when we judge it is the wrong time to deal with a disagreement. 3, accommodating. Accommodating is when one side gives in to the wishes or demands of the other. Often, one party accommodates another to preserve harmony or to avoid disruption. Usually, it is the NGOs or advocacy groups that do the accommodating. This is because they are sensitive to the fact that disagreeing may jeopardize the work they are doing or may affect their resources because the government is also the regulator. This is where the NGO does a risk-benefit ratio calculation and decides to accommodate. 4, compromise. Another strategy of dealing with disagreements is compromise. Compromise is used in a wide range of scenarios. In Singapore, social activists have found that it can be more productive to voice their disagreements with policymakers over some issues behind closed doors. Because the disagreement is voiced privately, policymakers are less defensive and they may be ready to listen to what is being advocated. Where the general public is concerned, it usually appears as if the policymakers are the ones who are the initiators of the change. This helps to confirm the assumption that has been propagated by the PAP, that the best and the brightest are within their ranks, and so only these chosen people have the answers to social issues. Civil society often accepts this way of working behind closed doors, and usually it is glad that some progress is made to read the issue, even if civil society does not get the credit for that. 5, collaboration. Now, collaboration happens when civil society is both assertive and cooperative. There is the possibility of co-creating a shared solution. This is a good strategy. When the matter is sufficiently important, civil society should put in the time and effort to really get what it wants and build its relationship with the policymakers at the same time. This is the collaborating mode, sometimes called win-win. Often, This is reserved by civil society when the outcomes justify the investment it takes. Women's organizations have been working on the issue of violence against women for many years. Compromising and collaborating with policymakers has helped in the formation of legislation, policies, and social infrastructure to deal more effectively with the issue. Policymakers are much more ready these days to consider collaboration with civil society. NGOs are nowadays often asked to give input on proposed new laws or tweak existing laws. If we look at the year-long series of conversations on women's development, the policymakers reached out to NGOs and encouraged them to take part in the conversations and/or to make submissions. Also, when COVID hit the foreign workers' dorm last year, as we heard from Jeremy earlier on, and the government was struggling to handle things, it welcomed the help of NGOs, and at least to some extent, there was collaboration. I welcome this much more open and enlightened attitude of policymakers and hope that they will fully embrace the collaborative approach and see the value of engaging with civil society on the points of disagreement. There may still be disagreement after the engagement and dialogue, but it is the process of engagement and discussion that builds mutual understanding and trust and lays the groundwork for effective and productive collaboration. A state that recognizes criticism is not weak or disunited, but rather strengthened by its capacity to listen and discuss alternative views, because the contestation of ideas is a necessary part of democracy, as stressed by Professor Tommy Cole. The disagreements of today could well be the agreements of tomorrow. When we started AWARE in 1985 to work for gender equality, there were many people, including policymakers, who disagreed with our goal and our approach. Today, gender equality is seen by the policymakers as a fundamental value that Singapore must embrace. It just took 35 years for us to reach this happy agreement. I would like to end, if I may, David, with a quote from Professor Chan Heng Chee, who emphasized on the value of engagement between policymakers and civil society. She said that civil society organizations, quote, act as the conscience of society. They are like the canary in the coal mine. They give us warning signals of what can be wrong in a society. They shed light on issues that governments and other institutions can miss, unquote. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kawanjit. That's rich information there, not just on the strategies, but I think with concrete examples that I'm sure we'll come back to you to draw on your experiences and your views, right, on how to deal with some of these very important but also very sensitive issues. Now over to Walter. Walter, what about an academic and a policy person? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks everybody for inviting me and hosting this. So I think we spent a large part of today discussing how to have useful disagreements, and I want to come at this from the perspective of an economist and social scientist. Someone once said, and I think the Minister for Law said this most recently, but it was also said this morning. The point is, what was said was we can have disagreements about policy and what's the right thing to do, but we can't have disagreements on the facts. And that kind of view has intuitive appeal. Now, if you know what the facts are, then surely a rational person couldn't disagree with a policy motivated by the facts. And I thought I want to unpack this a bit. Okay, I want to ask the question, what's the role of facts when we disagree about the matter of policy? And I want to first start with a very straightforward fact, okay? One that would matter for decision-making, by the way, and that would be the law of gravity, right? Look, if gravity works, if it's proven, when you step off a balcony, you're going to fall to the ground. That kind of fact, obviously, once I convince you of it, would also convince you to not step off balcony. So there's a very clear and obvious implication for decision-making, right? So that's one fact. But there are also other kinds of facts, okay, which don't have a straightforward implication for any sort of decision making. So here's a fact, right? If you happen to have a same gender couple in a relationship and no one is transgender in that relationship, then they cannot have biological children with a shared genetic heritage, okay, unlike mixed gender couples. So that is a fact based on the state of the current science, right? I mean, you might wish it was otherwise, and there might be research trying to overcome that, but based on the state of current science, that happens to be a fact. But it is not a straightforward policy relevant fact, because the question is, does it motivate any obvious policy or decision? And I don't actually think it does, unlike the law of gravity, right, which tells you not to step off balconies to your death. And what I'm getting at is, in the realm of policy, actually, a lot of the facts that matter for policy are more like the latter rather than the former. Okay, we all think that we're arguing about the law of gravity in policy. Once we know what the facts are, we will do something pretty obvious. Don't step off tall buildings, right, for example. But actually, a lot of the facts we deal with do not unambiguously lead to a particular course of action. And people can and do disagree about what should be done, even if they happen to agree on the facts. But actually, it's worth it that. Okay, it doesn't stop there. I'm going to argue that a lot of the facts relevant for policy, maybe even most of them, are not even facts in the sense of scientific laws or principles. They are instead facts which represent estimates. You know, sometimes they're very good estimates, but they're estimates regardless of the truth of the matter. One example in my field would be the unemployment rate. Okay, the unemployment rate is a statistical estimate. But not only is it an estimate by itself, it doesn't actually tell us what we should do or think, okay? For example, what we really want to know, the fact we really want to know when talking about anything related to the labor market is, what is the effect of a policy or course of action the government is going to take on unemployment? That's the fact we want to know, okay? Did the government's policy cause unemployment, or did it relieve unemployment? Well, there is a huge amount of research in economics on questions like this, but we actually cannot determine answers to these questions with the same quality or precision as principles like the law of gravity, okay? I mean, you know, we can say there's plenty of research suggesting a given policy caused unemployment, but we cannot guarantee that if you were to create a new policy, just like the old one, you would get the exact same effect on unemployment in the future. So it's very different from the law of gravity. You know, physicists have complete confidence that gravity works all the time, everywhere, the same way on this planet. Economists do not have that kind of confidence with most economic facts, right? So the point I'm making is, you know, for a lot of the big policy and social questions we argue and talk about, certainly saying that we shouldn't disagree about the facts is a very reasonable way to start an argument, but it actually does not always bring you closer to making a good decision. You know, it's kind of illusory, right? We think we agree on the facts, we know what to do, and therefore we'll be able to make good policy, but that's actually an illusion. And when you look deeper, it turns out that a lot of these facts we're talking about are not really facts, but they're actually just pretty good estimates quite often. Okay, so that's one broad point I wanted to make. The other point I wanted to unpack is what we can do as social scientists is we can probably do a lot more to understand how people actually think about facts and policy. And here I'm going to be drawing on the work that's been done by Stephanie Stancheva and others at Harvard. Okay, so, you know, if you're concerned about the quality and place of facts in political and social debates, one thing you would do, obviously, is study what people actually think the facts are and why they think so, okay, and what happens because of that. And that's what her research does. In a number of studies, she surveyed thousands of people across many countries on their understanding of facts like unemployment rates, crime rates, welfare rates, how many immigrants there are in the country. These are all politically relevant facts. So the punchline from her research is that, generally speaking, people have no idea what the facts actually are. You know, for example, they often think that immigrants are far more likely to be unemployed, uneducated, and on welfare than they really are. And people's understanding of the facts, or their misunderstanding, is actually pretty strongly correlated to their political beliefs and background. So if you're politically right-wing in some of these countries, you're probably more inclined to believe that the facts are that immigrants are jobless, survive on welfare benefits, and so on, all those negative views, right? Second point of this research is that the beliefs about these facts do affect policy thinking. Okay, you know, if you support anti-immigration policy, you'd be more likely to look for or believe in facts that say that immigrant behavior justifies your policy thinking. And empirically, this line of research finds, for example, that those people who believe that who believe the facts are that immigrants are on welfare are actually more likely, they're actually less likely to support welfare programs, right? Because, obviously that's inconsistent with their view of the world. Next interesting thing, I think, which is quite relevant is presenting real facts or the truth to people actually doesn't do much to change the belief in the facts as they think they exist, okay? So in these surveys, some of the surveys ran an experimental portion where they gave respondents the actual truth before they respond on their views on policy, okay? So if you tell people the truth, for example, which is that immigrants don't take advantage of welfare to the extent that these people thought they did, turns out that presenting these facts doesn't do anything or does very little to change their view on supporting welfare or not, okay? So in some sense, you can't combat people's misinterpretation and misapplication of the facts with giving them the real facts. It doesn't really matter to them. They don't care. On the other hand, if you try to humanize the people that they're not happy about. So for example, if you present to people some anecdotes or stories about immigrants which are positive, actually that does appear to have some effect on their policy thinking. So telling them the truth doesn't matter, but telling them nice stories that help them see a different perspective does actually matter. So I think, if you want to apply this to the case of Singapore, one lesson would be that if Singaporeans are like populations elsewhere, then I think this idea of a fact-based approach to public discourse, it's important, but it is actually quite insufficient. And one of the issues here is that a fact-based discourse, that's the predominant line of argument used both by the government of the day and by the political opposition. I mean, one side claims that the facts all support the government's policy. The other side claims that the right facts are being withheld or are not being looked at carefully. And everybody, likes to think that they would change their mind or make decisions based on the facts. But the reality is the research shows people don't know what the facts are. And even if I gave you the facts in front of you, you wouldn't change your view of them anyway, quite readily. Okay, you usually wouldn't change your view. And more than that, there are also limitations on how useful the facts can even be for these policy and social decisions, right? So, just to wrap up, I just want to say that I think the most crucial fact of all, in fact, is unknowable, which is what would happen as a result of any policy decision we make. Policymakers want to know what would happen if they did something like relax COVID-19 restrictions. And you've got good models of what could happen. Those models are informed by the evidence thus far. But actually, our arguments are all about past facts, based on past experiences. When we're making these arguments, we're actually pretending to ourselves, in many cases, that these past experiences and facts will describe the truth in the future with certainty. But that's not true, you see? And so some respect for the uncertainty inherent in decision-making, the limitations, on fact-based decision-making and how we process facts as human beings is necessary, I think, to make better disagreements, okay, or come to better agreements. Right, so that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. I'm sure facts have different levels. It is the fact that you were the fourth speaker today. That's verifiable. Then there are also facts that if you start interpreting why I put you as the fourth speaker, that becomes an interpretation. And if I say that the fourth speaker was given more emphasis than the third, that's another a level of interpretation. So I think we'll come back to those issues, and those are really important because if POFMA is based on what defined as statement of fact, while legally the courts could decide something, Parliament and executive could decide something, the newspaper could write something else, the academic could interpret something else, and certainly the parties involved, right? And the question then is that if we want people to agree that POFMA is a good thing to have, an important thing to have, then we need to be quite sure about how we at least on a common page, even though we don't agree with everything. What do you mean by the statement of fact, for example? Right, we'll come back to some of these things. Now, what I want to do now is very quickly, I will try and ask each one of you a question that I can remember based on what you just said. And then I'll go to the questions that I've already tried to identify. In fact, I've taken down all the questions that appear in the Q&A box, right? But I'm going to take the take the prerogative of a moderator to ask each of you a question that I thought maybe the audience and myself and fellow panelists would benefit by hearing a little bit more based on what you just said. So if I could go to Taeyong first. Taeyong, I thought what struck me most was we certainly agree, I think most of us can agree with you that students today, just like what Kawanjit say, number one, they are no longer students of many, many years ago, right? You don't have a didactic approach like a lecture, right? Didactic, like you said there, I'm the expert, I tell you things, you copy notes, right? That's didactic. And you say you wanted a dialogic approach, right? A dialogue based on reasoning, logic, rationality, and based on a conversation with the understanding that the professor, the lecturer, the instructor may not actually have the best answer or have even the answer. So if I understand it to be that way, then my question for you is that in institutes of higher learning, or just in education in general, do you think the universities or the schools, whether you're talking about the presidents, the principals, the professors, and all, we are not of the younger generation, right? So we are quite different. In fact, we belong to the sort of older generation. We did not grow up in a dialogic atmosphere, right? We talk about it and we develop it now. But when we were students, we were actually exceptions if we acted in a dialogic way. So my question to you is that, in your honest opinion, do you think our people who are in leadership and our people who are actually saying that this is what we should do, are we actually being engaged in dialogic examples, strategies, and styles? Because if we don't, then it is going to be really tough, right? If we are didactic and then actually we tell them that we are in a dialogic situation. So a very blunt question is that, are we ourselves who are propagating that, especially when we are from a different upbringing? Do you think we are setting that climate and the atmosphere?
So David, I just want to answer your understand your question. You're talking about policy makers at universities, university leadership, and all these, whether they take a kind of a dialogic approach in terms of consultation, making policies, or they take a didactic. I know best. I'll tell you. You do it. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Very much so. I'll let you to keep it open. And then in the classroom, of course, we can always sit down and let's have a hypothetical debate. But in reality, we do make policies. In reality, we do decide the time to end the class now or not. So those are the real decisions that I'm more interested in.
Yeah. So I'll answer it in the following way. I think much will depend not just on personal inclination or personal styles, but also on structural issues, on the size of universities, on issues that need a decision that may be more executive, and issues which maybe have a longer timeline, for which consultations are needed and all this. But my general sense is that universities have now become very complex places, and stakeholders are many and multi-layered. And I think the days where you could have an autocratic university leader that takes unilateral decisions that impact so many people, I think are over. So I think university leadership is now in some sense collective, although you still have someone who has to call the shots. But there are boards of trustees, there are parents, there are students, there's the media, there's the public, there's your funder, there are ministries. So I think there are many layers and many dimensions of consultation that often happens behind the scenes. So people don't see it, they don't understand, and sometimes what they're encountered with is a kind of an end product of a decision, which may have gone through several months, if not longer, of consultation and iterations. And then somebody has to then ultimately, in consideration of all these factors, make a decision. So I think that, given the complexities, the size of universities these days, and the kinds of stakeholders that they have to deal with, you're not likely to have decisions that are not thought through, not properly consulted, and also not really engaged in terms of the kinds of different implications that a policy would have impact on. So just take the matter of, say, admissions, for instance. Yes, you can say that I just want students of a certain type of quality, but then there are national issues, there are national needs, and then there are also, considerations of fees, of revenues, and all this sort of thing. So things are actually very multidimensional and complex. So I think no decision is basically based on one person's preferred option, and it has to go through many layers of consideration and consultation. So I would say that it is not dialogic in a sense that there are a lot of public town halls before you come to a decision, but behind the scenes, I can tell you that a lot of these things happen.
Yeah, thanks. And I thought when it is not dialogic, it is quite important then that it is not didactic. In between, there could be various shades, and as you noted, there may be different stakeholders involved. I suppose the challenge is when that is indeed the case, how then do we, do you or do the rest present and communicate and engage so that when people think that it's not dialogic, then it must be didactic. And that's because, as you pointed out, that there could be a lot of things that goes on behind the scene. But if we don't know what goes on behind the scene, then we have to make conclusions using an anchor heuristic as what is most likely and so on.
Yeah.
And that's where not only your conspiratory theories might come out, even for a well-intentioned rational person, will pick one or two of the most likely reasons. And in the absence of information, we are then forced to gravitate towards one or the other. And that's very much, I think, like COVID. So
yeah, I fully agree with you on that. Yeah.
Yeah, we can surely come back to that. I want to go to Zakir. Zakir, what struck me when you say towards the second half of your comments, right? You made a statement that, for example, when it comes to race and I suppose religion as well, sometimes you actually receive as the media editor or as media, not just you necessarily, receive lots of comments, right? Various comments, and some are probably very visceral, and then you have to make a editorial judgment, right? What to present and so on. But you did make a statement that sometimes, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel that there is a need to play down the differences or play down the disagreements, because by not doing so, it might give the wrong public perception that these differences cannot be reconciled and we are going down the negative spiral. You didn't use those words, but a negative spiral due to social features. I definitely understand that. If we value social harmony, when somebody is going to make use of these to exploit for their own political gains, for example. But my question to you is that, isn't that editorial judgment you make a very tough one? Because it is very well possible that minority in statistical sense, not ethnic sense, a statistical minority, history has shown that sometimes they are right. So the minority voice actually is the agent of change. And sometimes when it first started, it could be pretty loud and aggressive and in your face. In fact, that's how science progressed, right? When we learn about science, actually there is some rocking of the boat, and then later everybody agreed that actually you are right. That's where we decided that the sun, it wasn't revolving around the earth. Now, what I'm trying to get at is that how do you make that judgment? Because my concern is that when editors make that judgment, you actually might present more consensus that there actually is. And then everybody looking at your consensus presentation, whether it's political leaders or academics and all, they get the wrong conception that there's a lot of consensus, and then things go on in status quo. Isn't that dangerous? Because all these constructive voice that actually could be the agent of change, and then we miss the window, and then we are a little bit too late. How do you react to that?
Thanks, David. No, I think that's a very valid point. And if I can cite an example, in this recent debate on foreign workers, especially foreign EP holders, we've had comments for some time actually. Foreign workers, first, especially if they're in the role of a hiring manager, then they start discriminating against Singaporeans, or they group around in their own kind. Some of them are very well thought through, well argued comments or even letters that say, I think surface an issue that a number of people feel strongly about, right? That when we sort of open the doors to these foreign talents, you also let in some and who basically start maybe discriminating against locals, and I think we've had some of that over the past few years, and I think in the interest of harmony, should we have amplified it immediately? Should we have blown up the issue or given it an airing? And I think we erred on the side of caution because you didn't want to be seen as stoking a potentially sensitive issue at the time. Might we have done it differently? Maybe. It's tough. I think hard hard to say whether, we had we. I think I agree with you that I think we shouldn't unnecessarily, or we shouldn't present, a consensus on a topic when we know there isn't one. But I think it's also not quite the right thing to do to kind of downplay strong sentiments from a minority, vocal though they may be, when actually it continues to remain the views of a minority.
I'm going to change the format a little bit just to follow up very quickly before we
Sure,
move
yeah.
thought, right? But if I can then follow up and say, but if people counter and say, if you don't do it, the
Yep.
social media and everybody else is doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So either we are living in a different world, there's a lot of differences, arguments and
Yep.
voices, and then in the mainstream media, everybody is happy, consensus, or even not talking about it.
Yeah.
And you might not think it's the good time, right time, but other people are talking about it, and in your own judgment, they are not doing it, for example, as wisely or as better as you could have done. Then what do you do? Do you not then join in? Do you not start the direction? Do you just keep quiet?
Yeah. So I think that's a very good point. I think we then try and adjust as we go along. I think on the issue of race, for instance, I think probably because the mainstream media was low thought averse to documenting or airing some of these grievances and concerns. That's why we see these platforms like Minority Voices, for instance, and all these other calls, especially by younger people on social media for sharing of experiences. I think it's good that that's happening. It's honest. But I feel it also kind of misrepresents the situation in a way. And I think on some of these issues, I think the divergence between what goes on social media and what goes on the mainstream media is already there. It's bound to be there. I think the challenge is to not, let this divergence grow into a chasm that is too big to bridge, where you get two alternate realities. But neither do we want a situation where the mainstream media goes when what we amplify is the views of a vocal, or at least more concerned group of people in society, when actually by and large the overriding the prevailing atmosphere when it comes to issues like race, when it comes to issues like discrimination, I think by and large the overall situation is one that is fairly peaceful. It's harmonious. Yes, there are issues, and many of these issues have come to the fore, but neither should this dominate or prevail all the time. It's a tough challenge, and I think we struggle with this almost every day.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Right. Actually, I think most of us know that when even when you talk about the Western media, all editors make political and editorial judgments, right? And you can't escape from the fact that the personalities involved in making those judgments and the organization matters a lot. I'll very quickly go to Kawanjit. We'll come back to this again, but I just want to ask Kawanjit for a brief response on a little bit of what you said. Right, you gave several examples, which many of us are familiar, and you are right that in some particular examples that you gave, we still don't really know what happened, and some of us are more bothered by others and want to find out more. But by and large, I think the approach seems to be, let's not talk too much about that, whether it's good or bad. Then I want to ask your personal experience though, right? In the present day, you continue to be involved after these decades, and from all your experience, when you strongly disagree with the government or the policymaker on the cause that you believe strongly in civil society as you advocate it, what do? You have given us 5 different styles: accommodating, compromising, and all. But let's focus on policymakers, the powerful ones. You disagree strongly, you believe in your cause, and their response to you is that I understand you, but that's not the norm and that's not the mainstream value that you are advocating. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think if you believe in it and you think the cause is important enough, and I'm not talking as an individual, I'm talking about as a group, you press on with your issues. Then you try to get the public on your side. You try to combine service with your research so that you can then present evidence-based research, which is from the ground. And once you have evidence-based research, you have given examples to the public who was saying of like some women who have been abused by violence or migrant workers. So then it becomes much more real. It is the lived reality of the group that we are trying to represent. And then with all this, I mean, you cannot rush. You cannot go and challenge the policymakers and say, I am right and I want you to do this, even though you have a moral basis to doing that. So after you've collected all that information, you've got the public a bit on your side, then you make another attempt at collaborating with the government. And as I mentioned, we have, in a way, this is what we've been doing for 35 years. And now the government has agreed with us. I mean, it was a complete surprise that they completely agreed with what we have been saying and which has been ignored, neglected, avoided, sidestepped for the last 35 years. So the important thing is to be true to your principles, to keep in touch with the ground, to do your research, evidence-based research, qualitative, quantitative research, to give examples from other countries, how the issue is being, and then try to present it to the policymakers again.
And perhaps when the strategy that you have been using does not work, it might be good to take a pause to see what other strategies might work better because of changing times, changing circumstances, and so on. Because if we don't do that, sometimes we do a disservice to the group that we are fighting for, right? Because it just backfires and so on. And now over to Walter. Before I ask you some questions that I already have taken down, I have 4 or 5 questions. Walter, you of course was a member of parliament, a nominated member of parliament. I hear you very often in parliament. You do bring up studies, social science facts or social science findings. It is quite clear that sometimes when you and others bring things up, it is not really the position of the executive and they disagree with you. Sometimes your position might be closer, say, to the opposition parties or to somebody else's position, but you are an NMP. How do you deal with such disagreements when you are very sure that the facts are on your side and you are there actually sort of representing the academic space? How do you deal with that when you are so sure that after listening to the minister, you still think you are right? How do you deal with it?
Well, David, first, I guess I want to say that actually quite a number of us could have been picked to say something about Parliament. Yeah, because somehow this panel got a lot of NMPs, don't know why. But okay, I'm going to answer this obliquely, okay? Or maybe less than obliquely, but here's the answer. I think I want to disabuse everybody of the notion that any modern parliament is a place where policy decisions are made based on fact-based debates. Certainly, it suits all governments everywhere to have the public believe this and to sell the message to the public as far as possible that come to parliament, or rather come and watch parliament because we're going to have a big debate about the facts and arguments there. And at the end of this big debate, we will do whatever is the right thing to do. Okay, the truth will come out. I mean, all governments tell people this is the parliamentary process, but actually it doesn't work this way in any parliament, I think. And it doesn't work this way because of party political systems. And because if you as a government bring a policy or law to the table, you had better have already considered everything extremely carefully. So let me unpack this a bit, right? First, I think the reality is all parliamentary democracies have got a party political system. And that means that MPs don't make decisions, actually, parties do, right? I mean, of course, MPs as part of parties do, but you get the point. And parties have to come to a careful decision on what they're going to do, whether they're going to support a bill or not, if they're not in government, or if they are in government, how to structure a bill or policy, right? And that means that the plans they've made will have been made well in advance, and their plans are not going to get derailed by what happens in a parliamentary debate. It's just not going to, right? The threshold to change an individual MP's mind in a debate is incredibly high. That MP is going to have to be convinced in that, listening to the opposition after 20 minutes, they're going to have to be convinced that their party is completely in the wrong after hearing a 20-minute speech, and they're going to have to be willing to go against their party view and take the political consequences. I mean, this can happen. MPs do, can vote in unexpected ways, and they've done so in many parliaments, but I would submit that it does not happen every day, and you should not expect it to happen most of the time. It doesn't, right? So that's one point. I think the second point is, earlier, I think I alluded to it earlier, right? A policy or a law will come to debate in parliament after, in a stable democracy, it will come to debate after it's been carefully developed, right? If you're the minister and you want to enact a law, you would have spent months, your civil servants would have spent man or woman years, maybe decades, considering all the facts, right? So why would we assume that what they hear in 5 or 10 minutes of debate, okay, is going to turn up anything so surprising that it will cause a fundamental rethink of your basic position? Okay, so there is room, I think, in these debates to come to some adjustments around the margins. And this can happen especially if something comes up which would cause a basic problem with, for example, the bill being proposed, because there would be an issue with the law. And so some minor adjustments can happen. But, in general, my point is just view that Parliament is about carefully considering the facts and arguments, because the MPs go into the chamber not knowing what they're going to do. And after 5 hours of debate, they'll magically be informed as to the correct course of action for the country. That is not consistent with the reality in any Parliament, I would think. Okay, the facts and arguments have been considered. They are considered very carefully by any mature, stable democracy or political party, which I consider this government to be one of, right? But they're not considered in the debating chamber. It happens outside of it, beforehand. So what's the purpose of Parliament then, right? So I think the best way to think about Parliament, and I think the end, the way I came to approach it, I think, is that it's really an opportunity to contest narratives based on the facts that you bring to the debate. The government will bring a certain set of facts and a certain narrative. The opposition will bring another. NMPs and other parties may bring their own sets, okay, of narratives and facts to the debate. But Parliament is not a court of law, right? It's not about trying to find what the real facts are in a matter. It's to have a formal hearing of agreements or disagreements on a policy, and then for the government of the day to basically dispense with those disagreements and to go ahead with the policy that they want to implement, right? But what you can do, I think, as an individual parliamentarian, this also applies for government MPs who may not agree with 100% of what the party wants to do, is they can bring their narrative to the table, have it heard by everybody, have it broadcast by the media, for example, where then the public may or may not agree with it. And if there's enough of a sense that the public feels that you are going on a path, or you have an argument that the government have not fully considered, then policies do change, right? That change will happen, it can happen, but one should not expect it to happen at the end of that 5-hour debate where the government suddenly goes, yeah, these guys are right. Somehow we didn't think of it beforehand. That would not happen, I would think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, that's a very interesting answer, I think. So I have taken down the questions from the audience. I'm going to paraphrase one question, and I thought it's a good point of departure that Walter has given us. Right, the question goes something like, I think it followed from what Kawanjit, your presentation said, but anybody can answer this question. Is the strategy called collaboration actually meaningful in any political space? Because in politics, it's about competition. So you have competition, you have collaboration, you have your 5 strategies, and in other words, when politics are involved, and then the parties need not be political parties. It could be you and I fighting for different causes for the same resource, and only one of us can get it, for example. The question is really about political competition is inherent. How can you talk about political collaboration? Is it possible? Anybody, could be Zakil, could be Kawanji, to talk about that, because I think it's also a media issue, right? Because we are basically telling them we love Singapore, we may be from different political parties or different ideologies, let's work together. But if we have different parties or different ideologies and there's a competition space that we are trying to convince you to be mine, or convince voters to vote for me, is political collaboration actually practically feasible or even desirable?
Can I just give an example of in Scandinavian countries, most of the governments are coalition governments. So when policies come before them, that's off. I mean, the competition is not as much as in like us, bipartisan or others. So I think collaboration is possible, and it also depends on what the issue is. So I think competition is a very cutthroat type of a strategy. and the winner takes all. And so you must be really strong in your power structure. You must be strong in seeing the spillover effects if you put that policy into effect. So I think it's a risky strategy. So I think collaboration is a much better strategy. You please more people. And although Walter says facts are, something you can dispute about, I think there is a role of facts and logic and reason. And, even though it may be overstated. So I think collaboration is definitely possible. And even now, when you look at power structure where women and men work horizontally, where there is a lot of network and we collaborate, while in a hierarchical situation, it's much more competition. I will let the other panelists say more on this.
Yeah, I think Walter and I and others do agree that facts do matter, but I think we're saying that facts by themselves is not going to be the only thing that's going to move things. Right? Sakil, any comment?
Yeah. No, and I think I agree with Kanwaljit that, I mean, closer to home, Indonesia, you've got a very diverse political space, but the current government has a strong supermajority and shows that political collaboration on some issues can be possible.
Is it possible in Singapore?
I think it is. Yeah.
So you see Workers' Party and PAP collaborating possible?
Definitely, I think.
Okay.
Maybe not at the current moment, but I think it's
headline tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right, over to Taeyong and
I don't know whether that's the right question, whether competition and collaboration are binary and then you have to do one or the other. Perhaps another way of looking at it is coexistence. I mean, you could coexist side by side and you can come to some sort of agreement in terms of terms of engagement. I think the Latin phrase is modus vivendi, right? In a sense, how do you then coexist? Although you may be in conflict, but you don't have to collaborate. You can compete, but you can compete on terms that are acceptable to both sides. Yeah. And then you coexist. So is that a kind of a middle path that in a way is something that is more common in mature democracies?
Yes, Walter.
Yeah, maybe I just wanted to add something here, which is that I think one thing which we are not very used to, I think is the idea that it's perfectly all right to have decision-making bodies where a significant percentage of the decision-making body disagrees with what the majority goes with, but they might disagree on issue A, but they might agree on issue B, and so on and so forth, right? And, there's no reason why disagreements on a couple of issues should cause them the working relationship to break down irretrievably and for the decision-making body to be illegitimate in some way. But I will say that in Singapore, we seem to have this belief, which I've seen in terms of a lot of the decision-making bodies, whether it's statutory board, councils, commissions, and things like that. The belief we seem to have is that these bodies need to present a unified front, always, Now, of course, there might be a lot of disagreement that happens behind the scenes, but it's kind of like the parliament versus not parliament distinction I talked about, right? Parliament is for show, it's for all the arguing to happen on a showcase, on a stage, but the real deliberation happens outside of it, because that's where you can have those talks free of public scrutiny, in a way which might not be a good thing, but the point is that's when people feel more free to actually hear everything and change their view if necessary. Whereas in Parliament, you have this problem that I think was alluded to in the morning session, that the outsiders are looking at you and you got to be keeping that in mind. So you can't react the same way that you would in private. Okay, but going back to decision-making bodies in Singapore, we have this, I think, mode of operation in Singapore where if I've got a commission, I expect all of the commission to sing the same tune every time a decision is released. Of course, it's perfectly fine and in fact even expected if behind the scenes they argue a lot with each other, but everybody better support it once it comes out. And you can contrast this to, I think, how it's done in a lot of other countries where if you've got 5 commissioners, perfectly normal if on some decisions, 2 commissioners say, oh, this decision is terrible, I completely don't agree and this is why. And on another decision, if a different bunch would disagree and so on and so forth. I mean, that's what you see in a court of law, right? Where you do have judges who, if they feel they particularly disagree with a decision is being made, they write a dissenting opinion. But in Singapore, that only happens in the law courts. And as far as I know, I'm aware, in almost any other major public body, the practice is disagreements happen behind closed doors. Once everything comes out, nobody is to say anything that even hints that this was not a unanimous decision, which I think is not healthy. But I think that if we want to cultivate more frank disagreement that is not contentious in Singapore, we could really start at the top, meaning that we could start by advising all our various commissions, boards, and so on, that it's perfectly all right if some of your members want to say after a decision comes up, they didn't agree and why. Nothing wrong with that, you know?
Kawanjit?
David, I just want to make a quick remark. I think of our 5 national values, harmony is the one that is valued the most. So we have to present an external harmonious demeanor. So that's why, and I think, you know, if you look at, as Walter was saying, I mean, everything doesn't have to be harmonious. I mean, and then even, for example, if you look in Parliament, both Workers' Party and PAP agrees that the wages of the lower 20% must be increased. But they keep on talking about progressive wage, minimum wage, and all that. So they are actually agreed. But to them, the way to get to the end, it seems so important because it is the observers listening. If the PAP agrees a little bit to what the Workers' Party says, then they will say, oh, they're a weak party. So I think, you know, we need to be more sensible human beings, all of us, and we must connect with the common humanity that we have been talking about. So, and that is what we as Singaporeans need to cultivate a bit more.
Yeah, I'm going to say this bold statement. I think all parties need to learn that when you praise and agree with the other party, it doesn't mean you are weak, right? To many of us observing, it means you are strong. It means that you're confident enough to acknowledge that they have a good point. And then you can just elaborate and counter it and agree with it and say even a better point, right? And there is really no need to put down the other point down, which what Tommy and I said earlier, that if people have good intentions, that's the starting point, right? You might think you are better, but let's see how I can take your view and do it better. You know, we have a running joke that if you want a dominant party of any country to adopt a view, don't tell the dominant party your view, tell the opposition your opposite view, and then the dominant party will then adopt the opposite of the opposition's view, and that will be your view. Right? I mean, if we have that kind of mentality, it's really going to be sad. Now, I have 2 questions that I'm going to combine because I think they are related. Right? One question goes something like, is our education system, meaning from schools all the way to universities, is our education system churning out students who are very politically agreeable or politically disagreeable, right? Is our education system churning out students that are politically very disagreeable on everything, you know, or they're very politically agreeable? And I will combine it with another question, which goes something like, is politics defined in Singapore too broadly, such that whenever you are doing something that is socially conscious or whatever, then people call it politics, and then you're not supposed to talk about it, or you're bound by certain rules. So there are 2 issues, and I think they are related, right? Because if you think that politics is defined so broadly, whatever I say is politics, and then when it comes to politics, I'm supposed to keep quiet, either that or you join a party, right? That will make me politically very agreeable, just I'll keep quiet, right? On the other hand, if it's not the case, I can come out and freely and speak and be politically disagreeable. Taeyong, you want to take that as a person with lots of experience with not only Yale and US, but with lots of other students?
Okay, so I'll take a step at this. I think it's very hard to generalize whether the education system are producing people who are more politically apathetic. I think the word's not agreeable, but apathetic, or students who are more engaged. And I think it's hard to say, but I've seen over the years that students, as I said earlier, are becoming more and more engaged with a range of issues. And you're right, David, it's not just politics. I don't know how many students will eventually go and contest elections and join political parties. Some of them do, but they're interested in issues around them. And, in this world, these are all connected in some way, one way or another. And if the issues or the causes are linked to policies and policies are linked to parties and all this, then of course there's that political connection. But having said that, I don't think there is a kind of a reverse in terms of students becoming less interested. In fact, they're becoming more interested in issues. And even if the issues touch on politics, I think they're prepared to engage. So, LGBT rights, gender rights, social inequality, minimum wages, climate change, divestment, I think these all have political dimensions, and students engage them. So I think that's okay. And I see that happening across all campuses. And there are different levels of interest, of course, different types of organizations, but students engage them. So I think we're seeing a whole range of things happening, and not necessarily all leading to along the road towards kind of a political action. But I think there are lots of causes that students are taking up. So I don't see apathy happening, but at the same time, politicizing of campuses is also not something that is very evident. Although, as you said, once you critique a policy and critique a kind of a political position, I think you're seen as engaging in politics. But I think students do that, and they are prepared to open up and talk and invite speakers of various hues to come and engage them in these discussions. So I see that as a good sign.
Kawanjit?
Well, I think in Singapore, politics is defined too broadly. Everything we do in life has to do with politics. We're not talking party politics and I think this is the problem in feminism. The personal is the political.
Yeah.
And I think an incident like Catherine Lim, who wrote The Affective Divide, and she was chided that she wanted to take part in politics, then she, that she should join a party. So I think up to recently now, of course, I think the younger members of the PAP have become more, I don't know what's the word to use, but I think politics by the earlier generation was too defined, too narrow. I mean, too narrowly, and and if you anything too broadly, rather, sorry, and if you did anything that it was a social issue, that was a moral issue, it was then defined as politics. And if you wanted to talk about it, join a political party. So that should be stopped. Many of us are very political in what we want to do for society, but we don't necessarily want to join a political party. We don't want to become a leader but like people like nominated members of parliament, we are political, and yet we don't aspire to join party politics.
Well, actually, I think, of course, the situation has evolved a lot, right? I have read editorials, commentaries by Zakil, who's in Straits Times. I have listened to Tai Yong's talk, especially in not just his IPS, Nathan Fellow talks, but other talks. I've listened to Water in Parliament, and of course, Kawanjit, I listened to a lot of what you said, and some of you have read my articles. Many of the things that five of us say here can be construed as an affective divide today. If we were to write the same way during Catherine Lim's time, it's different. Today, we are writing it, and some of us are writing it even in a harsher manner, right? But we use words like trust deficit, which is a much stronger word than affective divide, Trust deficit is a very strong word, but times have changed. I think some of us would like it to change faster. Some of us feel that it's changing a bit too fast. I think those are important issues. Now, I know time is catching us. We are okay on time, but I do want to combine two questions and ask, or before that, maybe I want to ask Zakir, give Zakir a chance to, all these graduates, undergraduates that Tayan talk about, they become your reporters, They are all your young reporters, right? They come from not only communication schools in NCUS and NTU, SMU people join journalism as well, and so on. And then when they come to you, they are in the real world, right? It's no longer a safe environment within Yale, NUS, or SMU where you can invite parties and talk. Now you are writing things, and you just said earlier that you need to sometimes play down differences and so on. Do your reporters have this issue?
No, I think some of our reporters are from Yale and US as well, and I think no, I think some actually actively disagree on us playing down certain issues, and to be fair, I think some of them have helped persuade us to change our positions, maybe not entirely, but slowly, and to reflect more divergent views and alternative views in our pages. And I think it's important to have this, that they continue to bring fresh approaches, because if we're not kind of keeping up with what other generations or younger generations want to see in their mainstream media, then I think we're not doing our job well as well. And in fact, some of them are helping us with our, starting our TikTok accounts and exploring other social media platforms.
I think it would be great if we can trust the media to the extent that we see our reporters and editors have a good intentions, but your nation building is defined as able to surface the differences, giving voice to somebody's quotes, for example, which is actually against your own editors or reporters' position, right? I think that would be ideal. Then you are really a professional exhibiting your role, because you are not propagating, but you are presenting, giving voice to a position that's actually against your personal position. And I think that's what professionals are about. Just like a scientist can talk about a lot of things, it might be against your religious belief, but you have the impartiality to talk about it. I'm going to close soon with probably the last question, because two persons asked this. And I think the way this should be phrased is very simple. Do you think our leaders are setting a good or bad example in terms of dealing with differences and, dealing with disagreements? Come again. Are our leaders setting a good example or a bad example in showing how to deal with disagreements? They didn't say what kind of leaders. So you can talk about political leaders, university leaders, media leaders, academic leaders, civil society leaders. Maybe we go round. Who is bold enough to talk about leaders of any shades? You can speak in the general abstract if you like, but it would be great if you can, talk about a particular type of leaders or examples. It's quite a direct question. Our leaders. So please talk about your position about leaders in Singapore. Tayong, you are the bold one. Come.
Okay, so I'm just gonna refer, I guess, what this question is probably trying to get at is our political leaders, huh? And I'll just say this, and I say that they've come to a situation, or Singapore has come to a situation where you need to in a way be more consultative. The kind of styles of leadership has to evolve to take on board a more sort of mature society that wants to have discussions and want to have their voices heard. And I think if this is the kind of environment that politics is being played out, I think our political leaders have also adapted, and I think they have learned how to deal with this. But what I'll say is, it's not so much the disagreements per se, but it's the styles of disagreements that where you can see different responses. So if it's debates, if it's just conversations, if it's robust arguments in parliament, even written exchanges, I think they know how to deal with it, and they've been dealing with this. But if it's breaking the law, libel, slander, assembly protests, I think that's where they draw the line. And you can say that they have not adapted well in that regard. But I think this is where I think they want to play within the law. And basically, if the disagreements happen within that, that's fine. And I think they know how to deal with it, and they've done reasonably well in that regard. But I think that there is a boundary, and any disagreements that or expressions of disagreement, let me put it this way, expressions of disagreement that go beyond this boundary, then I think then you're facing a different approach. And I'm referring, I guess, to the political leadership.
Okay. Zakil, any leaders of any sort?
I think I won't generalize, but I have to say, I think quite a number of the leaders I encounter are still fairly traditional in their mindsets, and I think some of them don't actually demonstrate a good example of how to deal with disagreements. We've seen that whether in corporate settings or in political or business settings. But I think that's inevitable. I think there are enough leaders who do show a good example of welcoming and engaging with disagreements. And I think these should be I think there should be more of these leaders rather than those who just shoot down dissenting views or who disagree with criticism.
Especially when we recognize that there are people observing, what you do really have a huge influence on other people looking at you and how you treat people and so on, right? How you treat truth and how you treat people. I think are important. Walter, you want to try?
Yeah. I'm also going to talk a bit about the political here, but I think this question also, it does speak to the earlier answer I gave as well about how one could probably set some example at the top with all those commissions and boards organized by statutory agencies of the government, where they could be more welcoming of public disagreement by the members, even though privately they do encourage disagreement. But if you want to go straight to the top, the political setup of Singapore, and this is something that's been raised before by Workers' Party as well as by, I think, maybe MPs of all stripes. That is, one could really think about strengthening the institutional role of Parliament in providing a forum for people to disagree with, or at least to critically inquire into government policy, right? So in a lot of parliamentary systems, there are standing committees that are set up to inquire into various aspects of parliamentary policy. But in Singapore, we don't have such standing committees. We do have certain committees of the House which are set up, to scrutinize the budget and certain other affairs. But because for such a long time, the Parliament was dominated or entirely was held by only one party, the government themselves had to set up these government parliamentary committees to inquire and look into various aspects of government policy. But there is a bit of a distinction, right, between a government parliamentary committee and between a standing committee of parliament, which is that traditionally in most parliaments, a standing committee whose job it is to look, for example, to transport labor or whatever issue, would be holding a lot of its activities in public, in the open. It's a political and public act. So there are public hearings, public calls for testimony, public conferences and so on. But obviously the PAP government parliamentary committees don't have to do any of this. And they do a lot of consultation to be sure, but they don't do it in public. And I think the public aspect is really important because it sends a signal down from the top itself, right? That in Singapore, it's perfectly okay to ask and inquire and to dispute things and to have it done in front of everybody, right? There's no need to have this done secretly in the back because you're worried about losing face or worried about offending somebody's, ego or whatever it might be, right? And I think a bit more of this from Parliament itself would go quite a way towards encouraging, I think, institutions of all types below that to also start doing some more of this more publicly. Okay, but I just put it out there, and I think that's something which has been, again, like I said, proposed in this term of Parliament, and it is up to the Parliament to decide what they want to do about that. Okay. Yeah.
And Kawanjit, before we go round for one statement each on what you really want to say, what about leaders in political, public, private, and people sector? And not just political leaders, right? We have focused a lot on political leaders. Are all these leaders, civil society, fighting for their cause? Are they setting a good or bad example in your opinion?
Well, it depends on the cause. And I mean, nothing is homogeneous. The political leaders are heterogeneous. There are some who set very good examples, others who don't. Similarly, in civil society. Now, the thing is, I just want to keep that changes. Before you change your behavior, you think your attitude has to change, and then your behavior, and finally you begin to advocate your change of behavior. Many of our leaders, whether they're corporate or political leaders, in their mind, they want to be more consensual, more agreeable, more listening to other people. But many of them, although their mindset has changed a bit, their behavior still hasn't changed, and that requires more time to do so.
Thank you very much. I'm skipping my closing remarks because I want to hear from you rather than you hear from me. I'm going to go around to each of you, and if you could spend about 1 minute, this is a test of your skill, right? And say one or two statements that you really want to say about dealing with disagreements. Zakir, you first.
I think disagreement. I think we all will have to deal with disagreements, and I think we can all do better in accepting and taking on board disagreements. Okay, we can all do better, right? And that's also Tommy's judgment, assessment, and I think many of us do. What about Taeyong?
So again, I'll come back to my role as an educationist. I think, and I quote Prof. Tommy Koh this morning, I think we have to accept that disagreements are natural and normal, and we will encounter it right through our lives. So having the ability to deal with disagreements in constructive ways is an important life skill. And I think this is something that should be cultivated in our young, and hopefully they'll carry it with them throughout their lives and know how to deal with these issues as societies become more complex and disagreements surface ever more often.
Yes, I like that word. Right? I think it's a life skill.
Mm.
Right? We all need to have it. What about water?
Well, I think the same people can disagree about something one day and agree about something else the next day. And they don't have to be mortal enemies just because they disagree about a couple of things now and then. And I think that's something very important to appreciate and understand, especially for when there's a power asymmetry in the relationship or there's a very powerful person who's disagreeing with somebody else. I think the other point, is just that I think while you've got to have a healthy respect for the facts, I think we also have to understand that the facts by themselves don't motivate policy action, decisions about anything on life. And, we've got to understand the limitations of facts and to understand that people can make decisions that sometimes seem to go against the facts, but they may nonetheless have very valid reasons in their own mind for doing them. And a bit more appreciation, I think, would go a long way.
Wanjit?
Just like our political leaders, we all love Singapore. We activists just disagree with the way that some things are run. So
Okay.
it comes back to what Tomiko said. We are either critical lovers or we are loving critics. And I think this is something that should be accepted. And it should not be saying that we should have bad, we have bad intentions if we ask certain questions or if we say certain things. We all love Singapore. We made this into our home, our country, and we should be allowed to voice our differences with respect.
I have one more question, but I don't have time to ask. This question, all of us go back and think, is it possible for a political party? This question says like, we have been told to put Singapore identity before religion, race, and so on. Is it possible for a political party to put Singapore's interests before party interests? So that question, we leave it open and for you guys to think through. I won't have closing remarks, but I do want to say that my own thought, right, and my own purpose of putting this conference together 2 years ago, which was delayed 1 year. And I want to thank everybody for doing this with me, not for me, but with me, because we are really on the same page. And I think what I really hope that we can achieve, and you have helped me quite a lot, I think in the past 8 hours that will be quite lasting, is that if we all learn, and we meaning everybody, from minister to just a student who are beginning to look at things, I think if we all can try to turn our harmful cynicism in an imperfect world to healthy skepticism, I think that would be great, right? We need to be skeptical like a scientist. We need to test our assumptions. We need to test claims because we believe in facts and rationality, right? So you must not be a complete faith believer and you trust everything that comes to you. You must be a good skeptic and healthy skeptic, but you must not be a harmful cynic, right? And you might love the country, but you do need some life skills to navigate, right? So that your love, I think, can translate into actions that can make a positive difference. I think that is possible. And the only reason why we are not on our holidays now and doing this is, I think, because we share that same common belief, right? That it is worth doing and it is possible. And it's not about us, not about the 12 of us today in this conference, but it is about the people listening in. And it's about everyone, I think, having that humility. Right? So with that, I really want to thank, obviously, the 4 of you who have spent, given us your time, but also to Tommy and Fok Kwang, right, in the first session, and to Su Ping, to Jeremy, to Sohun, and to Vincent, to Matthew, and to Chi Ying, right, for helping us with this conference. Most of all, of course, to my 3 admin staff and 2 admin staff and 1 research fellow, right, to help me to put this together. And I think the audience, you have been great. You persevere. It's not an interactive one. I can't even see your face, but from your questions and your attendance, right, I think it matters to you. I know many of you are civil servants out there listening. I think whatever we say about leaders, we hope that you can also think through and have to reflect and resolve and help make this place a better place, right? Where we truly can make a difference and a place where we can see hope and optimism and efficacy to make positive changes, right? Thank you very much.